might be, has understood that we don't need to tell the Afghans how to lead their lives. So I think the ingredients for success in Afghanistan are similar as they were in Iraq, similar, not the same, but we haven't yet confirmed and certainly resourced the correct formula. I think under President Obama and the catalyst his leadership still promises to be, with an outstanding military commander, in our case, looking at it from a military perspective, in Stan McChrystal, with whom I spent a number of hours in the, last week when he was over here, will allow us to get to the correct formula. There are some that question whether a victory for the Taliban will lead automatically to a resurgence of AQ-inspired terrorism in the UK and other Western countries. What I would ask you is, can we be certain that it will not? Is it a risk we can take? Historically, the relationship was very strong, and we know what happened, and I hope those trials recently concluded, the aircraft bomb trials, I think they were called, will remind us that this is a serious business, that there are people out there who would be very happy to put a bomb in amongst you right now if we don't continue to do something about it. There may be a debate about the role and efficacy of that in Afghanistan, but the principle that we need to do something, I think, I would just ask you to ponder. And if you don't agree with that, I'd be delighted to discuss it. Maybe I can't tell you all the things I know, sadly, but I can assure you what I'm saying, as far as I'm concerned, is true. The relationship between the two today, AQ and Taliban, is still very strong. It's fragmented to a degree because the AQ leadership, in particular, in the mountains of Pakistan. There may be some who believe that the Pakistanis could do more about them. I would just ask you to ponder military capacity in those very difficult surroundings. And while not wishing for one moment to act as a mouthpiece for the Pakistan army, I shouldn't and I couldn't. I do know, as a military commander, it's not as easy as you and I might think, and I just ask you to ponder that. And they're not as resourced sufficiently well as a successful campaign, such as we might like them to conduct, would require. But we shouldn't be naive about favours being called in the future, in the sort of heady aftermath of a perceived victory for the Taliban, for example, who continue to be supported actively by the AQ. And I think it was in a newspaper the other day that I used the word, the hugely intoxicating effect on extremists worldwide of the perceived defeat of the USA and NATO, the most powerful military alliance in the world. Anything, I think, then might be possible in their eyes, and that's what we should expect, despite the skill and courage here in this country and many others of our police, intelligence and security services. Factor into that the added dangers inherent in the spread of further instability to a nuclear-armed Pakistan. And Ahmad Rashid, who's wonderful to see again, will tell us more about that, I'm sure. But I again said in the Telegraph article that came out on Sunday, that for me, having looked into the sort of looking glass here, that is a very real and serious risk that we must continue to persevere in doing something about. You might think it's sort of pretty far-fetched, but it's not. And a defeat in Afghanistan could spread like contagion into certain parts of Pakistan. And we need to take that risk very seriously. Plus, I should add, the alienating effect on many millions of Afghans who have placed their trust in the West over the last 8 years, only to have that trust shattered. We promised them we would stand by them. Once we have broken that pledge and we have been defeated or gone to a CT strategy, as some describe it, I see that potentially as a catalyst for yet more bombs. I couldn't quantify it, but violence of some kind, this time of revenge and bitterness on the streets of London and elsewhere. We will, as one friend crudely put it, we will have dumped on the Afghan people. Why should we expect any loyalty in return after what we have asked them to go through in the last 8 years? finally, on a different note, factor in if you would, the enduring grand strategic impact on world stability. There are a number of fragile states out in the world, I look at them regularly with some concern, who are threatened by extremists or extremist movements. Can you imagine the demoralizing effect on the resolve of their governments and the inspirational effect on the extremists should we withdraw, they having in Afghanistan or be defeated, drawing the understandable conclusion that we are not going to look after them should they be next. A very, very dangerous long-term impact on people who at the moment rather cosily think we might come and help them, and the repressive effect that has on various extremists around the world who think we would still come to the aid of those governments. If you took away that understanding, over time, I think there's all sorts of implications. Just a couple of final points, because I know I haven't really answered your question about what we should do next, but there are all sorts of things I could say, most importantly, on how to organise ourselves. I think that's very badly done. But people have talked about it being our Vietnam. I don't think it is. I don't think the comparisons are valid at all. Vietnam was a regional war in a different era. The Vietnamese were not going to loose off bombs on the streets of New York or Britain. The communications era hadn't come along. Today, and I was rather proud of what I wrote here, today with national diasporas in the heart of our great cities, both grievance and violent solutions can be conveyed at the click of a mouse. So, of course, in one sense, in a military sense, it could become a quagmire. I'm very clear that if handled properly, that won't happen. But the implications of defeat in Afghanistan are completely different to the implications of defeat in Vietnam. That defeat was always going to be contained and was geographically, albeit large in one sense, was geographically localized. And I think in debate I'd love to talk about some of the more practical measures to do with organising and preparing to do the things which I suspect others are now going to discuss much more eloquently than I've managed. But thank you very much.
Thank you, General Richards. A very robust defence of the need for continuing engagement and the risk and a warning of the risks and the dangers if the engagement doesn't continue. Francesc Vendrell, you warned of the dangers of inaction. How do you see the next critical year ahead?
Well, I think it's worthwhile reflecting for a minute as to how on earth did we get into such a hole after the elections. My office, for example, I left at the end of August last year. And before that, from the beginning of 2008, we had been warning that the election was most likely to be either impossible to carry out because of security, or that there would be major fraud conducted, if only because the Pashtuns would not be able to vote in many of the districts. I am astonished. Another thing is the Independent Electoral Commission. I had been saying, and my office had been saying, the so-called Independent Electoral Commission is nothing of the sort. It was appointed by President Karzai, no consultation with Parliament, no consultation with opposition leaders or parties. Then we had the experience of 2005. In the parliamentary election in 2005, there was some massive fraud in southeastern Afghanistan. Of course, it went unnoticed, but it should have given us warning of what lay ahead. Then we had the registration process. In the registration process, it was in the very Pashtun areas where women registered the highest. This is the very areas where women are not usually allowed to go out, and in particular given the lack of security. And yet women were supposedly registering in much larger numbers than elsewhere. Now some people say, then we missed a golden opportunity on the 22nd of May. 22nd of May was the end of the Karzai mandate. Now it was an excellent moment before that to say to President Karzai, sorry, your term is over, so we have to discuss with other Afghan leaders how are we going to manage this transition. Maybe you can stay